I'm joined now by Richard Goldberg, who's a senior advisor at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. Richard, the real power in Iran, as we've been learning, rests with its supreme leader. What does Raisi's death mean for Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, given that he's 85 and Raisi was seen as his possible successor?
Well, there's a couple of big factors for the supreme leader at the moment. First of all, obviously, the supreme leader, Iran, has been on the offensive in the region since October 7th with its multi-front campaign against Israel. But also, he hasn't had to think about the internal unrest that he dealt with for a good 6 to 7 months following the murder of Mahsa Amini, remember, back in late 2022 into 2023. And so this is now a moment where he's going to have to contend with an election. And even though it's typically a sham election we would consider in the West, in Iran, that lends itself to legitimacy questions, people who may go into the streets, a renewed spark of protests. You just heard in the report the feeling on the street of, wow, these people are not invincible. They mow us down in the streets. They hang us when we come out to protest. And yet, look, the president just went down in a helicopter in a matter of minutes in bad weather. So I think he's going to have to start thinking about looking inward, which may take his focus off of the offensive he's been on since October 7th.
Well, Richard, we also saw in that report that there were people on the streets in support of Raisi's death, or not in support of his death, but in support of Raisi, mourning his death. There is going to be 5 days of mourning. What do you think will be happening behind the scenes regarding finding a successor?
Well, the supreme leader is going to want to maintain some level of stability so that he can have his choices intact for his own succession plan. That's going to be most important. He's not going to want to replace Raisi with anybody who has a big name or who has a power base of their own independently. He's going to want to curate that office and curate his succession as he, in fact, looks forward to potential demise as well. This may now put into play his son being the most likely successor. That's going to be controversial on the street in Iran. It's going to make it look like a right of succession passed from father to son, not something as part of what is supposed to be ideological, supposed to be part of the Islamic Revolution. So wouldn't expect any big names. Perhaps the first vice president, who's now serving as the interim president, stays on, becomes the president after this next election. There's going to be a regularly scheduled election in Iran next year. That might be when the supreme leader makes his real choice of his successor.
And Richard, how will these events be seen in the U.S., but also around the region?
Well, obviously, we reflect on the fact that Ebrahim Raisi is a mass murderer. I mean, that's our first thought. We think of so much blood on one person's hands, not just from terrorism sponsorship, but the mass murder of his own people. We think back to the late 1980s, when he was a hanging judge sentencing thousands of Iranians to their death as the head of the judiciary, again, supervising the oppression of the Iranian people. Just more recently, obviously, supervising the crackdown on Iranian women. And so we're glad he's gone. While we see some governments, including, frankly, the U.S. administration, making statements of sympathy or condolences, I think perhaps to avoid conspiracy theories that they were behind the death, we really do stand with the people of Iran and think about the victims of Raisi at this moment and think about ways that we can increase support for them so that one day they achieve their aspirations of a government that reflects them, not some wild ideology.
Okay, Richard, we're going to leave it there. Thank you for your opinion today. Speaking there, Richard Goldberg, who's a senior advisor at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies.